How's it going? I'm Henry. I'm a creative director working at Unit 9. So Unit 9, we call ourselves an innovation studio. It essentially means that we do a lot of work in the field of content creation, combining craft and creativity with emerging technologies. So obviously we are very excited with the whole renaissance of virtual reality. So I was going to speak a bit today about the remarkable possibilities of virtual reality storytelling, and it's a topic I think you guys have probably heard a fair bit about, so I'm going to sort of frame it in the context of a production that we've made that I think throws some light on it. So just to start with some of what I think are the more interesting possibilities of telling stories in VR. And by telling stories, I sort of mean any kind of narrative experience, whether we're talking about strictly like a passive thing like film or gaming, or even actually, as I'll kind of come on to talk about, a book, genuinely like a written storybook and how that might translate to VR. So some of the things I think obviously are more interesting, the most obvious one being spatial storytelling. I mean, it's clear, right? Like the story sort of happens all around you. But I think what I think is kind of interesting about that is it sort of has a more of a, all of these things sort of present a qualitative difference to how a story is experienced. And this is kind of one of the things with spatial storytelling is, on the one hand, when you have presence in a scene, it's obviously fantastically rich. It's possibly like the richest sort of media experience that we can give people as content creators. On the other hand, we still miss a lot of the, as the previous speaker was saying, we still miss a lot of the traditional kind of toolkit and craft of storytelling that has come up with the evolution of filmmaking, certainly, and even with games. So it's sort of a payoff between the two. One of the things I think is most interesting in the current evolution of VR is the possibility for shared immersive experience. So again, you'll hear a lot of filmmakers talking about the sort of the unique experience of watching a film in a theater, and it's not just because the screen is bigger, it's because that's essentially a social experience, because you have this sort of tension from the people around you and how they're responding to the film. And actually, with the advent of like the increased kind of capabilities of VR technology, we're going to be able to tell stories with like you having shared participants, everything from sort of a one-to-one level all the way up to potentially like an MMO, sort of like an arena level of a collective storytelling experience, which obviously the future is fairly fascinating there. We're just at the rudimentary beginnings of it. And also, lastly, the extremes of experience, which is just from the point of view of an avatar in VR, it's one of the fun things you can do. You can be dismembered, you can be shot, you can be eaten, you can do all of those things to other people, and obviously it's particularly interesting. So a few of the challenges, again, these have already been touched on, certainly like moving around and avoiding sort of throwing up. And I think this applies particularly to video, to 360 video, because the user is less in control of their own experience. One of the lessons of VR is the more ability you have to affect and control your own environment, the less likely you are to experience nausea of any kind. And obviously, yeah, like I said, the established tools of storytelling don't really apply. Like even in like the super high budget, very exciting sort of 360 film experiences, I still find like I miss the close-up. So like this kind of puts a limit on the sort of stories that work well in VR and those that don't work so well. So at least in my experience as a consumer of this content, I think that like the big sort of like big narrative kind of disaster sort of stuff where you're right in the middle of an action scene is obviously it's sort of highly exhilarating in a virtual experience. What plays maybe less well is like the interplay between two people in something like a rom-com or a drama where you're sort of requiring a close-up or you're requiring all the technique of film storytelling to really kind of get that emotional empathy across. And the difference between passive and interactive narrative. So one thing that we know that obviously the gaming market is clamoring for virtual reality, and it really makes sense from a gaming point of view, but will VR be able to sort of grow up and service people's needs for a purely passive narrative experience? Is VR going to talk to the people who just want to come home from work at the end of the day and put the TV on and chill out for a few hours? And will it do so to the extent that it makes it worth their while putting what is currently a big clunky sort of embarrassing looking headset on? So those are some of the challenges. This is the project that we've made recently with BBH in London, who are an agency who, in this case, we're working with Samsung. They came to us and they said, so we have an idea called Bedtime VR Stories for Samsung, and the crux of the idea is is to bring together the parent and the child for a bedtime story in situations where the parent is absent. So particularly if you're on business, so traveling abroad, you can be reunited with your child and share the same virtual experience at bedtime and tell them a story in VR. So this kind of got me thinking about the storybooks that I love, the books that I read to my kids, and obviously the ones that we remember. And I was just kind of imagining being immersed in a world that's kind of put together with this level of craft. And obviously I was very excited. And then I really got thinking about, like, what is actually a bedtime story? Like how do we break it down, and how would that experience translate to virtual reality? And for me, at least, it sort of threw up a few kind of interesting points about how we construct stories in VR. So particularly, so I think, like, the sort of the starting point for me is, like, bedtime stories are a cherished part of our culture. And by that I mean it's this very, very established ritual. It has these sort of predefined tenets that people sort of across cultures really buy into. It's something that you do obviously at bedtime, but it sort of requires you to be sitting next to your child. That intimacy is key to the experience. How do we recreate that when you're in two different countries? You have this sort of shared third-person point of view on the content that you're reading. So it may be a performance in that the adult certainly may be like putting on the voices of characters, for example, for the kid, but it's not a performance like a theater where one of you is on a stage and the other of you is purely passive. This is something that you're sort of sharing and kind of collaborating on. And this is, the more I thought about it, the more I realized it's like this uniquely intimate experience in our culture. Typically, the parent will drive. They'll choose the pace of the story. They'll choose, like, the tension in the build-up when you're turning a page is kind of an exciting sort of narrative moment. And the child obviously is free to disrupt this at any point, and typically does. And both can see and follow the words. So this was a key thing for us when we're building this environment in virtual reality, is we want to bring the words into the space. We want to make those words be visible to both of the users, because we may be making this for a child who's learning to read, and it's important for them to be able to recognize words and sort of match them with their phonemes. So this is the conclusion I sort of came to, which is that stories are really, bedtime stories particularly, are sort of a platform for parent and child to collaborate on that telling. And this kind of relays back to my point earlier where I was saying that the more sort of agency you can give the user in a virtual experience, it's like any sort of interactive experience really, but I think particularly in virtual experiences, the more power and agency you can hand over to your users, the more likely they are to define their own experience and make it something that you can't predict. And so that's really what we wanted to do going into this project. And then there were some key questions to answer, which are sort of the questions that you would have to answer with any game or any real kind of creative production. But again, they apply much more so when we're talking about creating a world in which our viewer is actually inside the space. So we had to answer this question: who are you? Like, what are you? What is your form? So this was a production we were making for Samsung, to utilize the Samsung Gear VR that has particular technical capabilities. So it is able to achieve sort of head tracking on a rotational way, so it can tell, like, which way you're facing, basically. It can't tell where you are on the Z-axis. If you sort of lean forward or lean back, the headset has no idea about that. So we're limited to making avatars which are essentially characters that sort of float in space, at least at this stage of the technology. This immediately had an impact on the design of these avatars, because we don't want to give them hands or bodies, because then the kid is going to, like, look down and see they have a body and they're unable to control that, and that might be confusing. So we started thinking about these avatar designs, which firstly are sort of cute, and secondly, there's no part of the body of the avatar that would obtrude or distract or get in the way of the story, essentially. You are literally a floating head. And there's ways of sort of that being quite sinister, and there's ways of that, like, taking the edges off that being a weird experience for what could be a 6 or 7-year-old kid. And then how do you explore? How do you actually, like, if we're creating the world of a storybook, how do you go out and, like, interact and engage with that world, and how alive is that world? I mean, I was talking about the tenets of bedtime stories, and a storybook is static, and that's kind of part of the charm of it. And I mean, I'm thinking back to Where the Wild Things Are, and it's like, as a reader of that story, as a consumer of that, I'm kind of filling in the movements of the characters, and I'm giving them their own sort of body language and personalities as someone who's just sort of imagining it as I'm going along. And do we want to kind of take that away from people and define our world sort of strictly, or do we want to sort of bring it to life and have characters animating? And this was something that we really discussed quite a lot, and I'm not saying that we came up with a perfect answer, but basically what we decided to do was try to create sort of a rhythm of storytelling which resembled the rhythm of turning a page, when you're actually reading a book. So you'd arrive in a scene, and the words would be written on the sky in the scene, and they'd always be in more or less the same place. And I'll show you guys this stuff in a minute. And so you always kind of know where to turn for it. And then the adult is able to turn the page by tapping the headset whenever they like. And every time a page turns, there would be a short moment of animation where the characters would sort of act out what had just been described in the last bit of copy. So it's like this sort of stop and start sort of rhythm, but it meant that the adult and the kid were completely in charge of the pace at which they told their own story. You can tap through it super fast, you can really take your time over it, you can really, if you want to, you can essentially ignore the story and tell your own story and just be looking around inside the space. And obviously it's critical that you can see where each other is looking and you can talk to one another. I think I forgot to mention that, sorry. You can talk to one another over VoIP, so you're able to sort of point out things in the environment to your kid, and yeah, you can enhance the story that you're telling, or you can tell a completely different story if you choose to. So these are some of the stills from the environment. The story which BBH was very, very much responsible for crafting was based on these three characters who sort of transport, like you begin in a bed because we wanted to reflect the real world conditions of a bedtime story. And to come back to my point about like how do you move around and explore a world, we're thinking like the key thing is like it's a story, it's not a game. So we don't want our kid and our parents to sort of separate away from each other at any point. We don't want them to like, I don't know, the other kind of weird thing is like as soon as you're moving around in VR, you need something to move around with, particularly with the technology of the Gear VR. So that would mean like some sort of gamepad. And as soon as you've got a gamepad, it's not really a bedtime story anymore, or at least not in my opinion. So we wanted to kind of move away from that. So the movements were all very controlled and very limited. And like I was saying, we wanted to reflect the pace and rhythm of turning pages in a book. So both, like, as the reader, I would sit next to my kid who's next to me on this bed. These characters are at the foot of the bed, and we basically created this environment where the world of the story unfolds around us. And it unfolds around us in full 360, but really most of the action is taking place in the front sort of 180 degrees, so that we're not requiring our child to sort of be turning around all the time. There are a couple of kind of cool moments where you sort of turn around, there's a massive, great dinosaur behind you, which I think was in this scene. But generally, like most of it's happening sort of in front of you, and we're trying to come up with sort of a meditative pace that is about, like, basically helping the kid to chill out and go to sleep. Anyway, so this was like the cloud land where you sort of fly up above the clouds, and then these dinosaurs sort of stick their heads up. And in every case, the bed would fly, but it wouldn't fly like a roller coaster. It would just sort of levitate gracefully. And every time it moved, it would have the same sort of cadence to its movement. Because again, we want to build up a repetitive rhythm. It's about lulling a child to sleep. And then you end up in space, and this is what we were calling the finale scene. And basically, there's a musical performance by the friend, the uncle, I think it is, of the robot. And the constellations sort of appear in front of you. And it was quite cool. So this is the video which BBH made to describe the project. And thank you very much.
Hello, Rose.
Hello?
Rose, it's Mummy. Do you want to see if you can pretend to hold my hand? I'm going away for 3 days. I need 3 outfits. And I'll speak to you in the morning?
Yeah.
In the evening?
Yeah.
Yeah. Love you.
I miss my mum's face when she's not in the house.
When I speak to her at night and she gets a bit emotional, that's quite hard.
Mommy, I love you and I miss you. Yes, please. My mum has a nice voice when she is reading.
Bedtime is when you know that they'll be missing you and they want you to be there. So that's the time that I really miss.
Hello?
Ah, hi!
Hi.
Can you see me?
Yeah.
You can wave too. I'm going to read you a story now, Rose. Rose, dear, shall we go on a magical ride?
Yeah?
Far across land and sea. Together we'll visit side by side. Can you read the last bit?
The most wonderful places to be.
Okay, let's go. Hold my hand.
We're flying!
Can you believe it? Oh, look at all the penguins. How many are we going to find?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5.
Can you reach them? Look at that really big one.
It's over there.
Just whistle or shout to bring them out.
There's a big dinosaur.
Look behind you. He must be their really big brother.
It's like this big. Wow.
Where are we?
We're in space.
Such amazing things we've seen. But the thing that makes them so magical is when you're there, Rose, by my side. It's the most wonderful place to be.
I felt that she was by my side.
I think you connect because you're doing an experience together, which is really special.
Hello. Encore.
I'm Jean-Pierre from Live to a 5D. It's beautiful, but I was interested, there's a sort of an age warning on the Gear VR of 13. How do we...
I thought someone would mention that. Yeah, there is. So if you look in the actual video, the kid is wearing a Google Cardboard headset. Because Samsung obviously can't be seen to be promoting the Gear VR to kids under the age of 13 because it would break their own terms and conditions. So it actually had quite a big impact on the development of the project because it was quite a pain developing for the two different platforms and getting them to talk to one another because Gear VR is sort of this walled environment in development. I think some of the developers are here actually, so they would know about that. But yeah, the sort of the creative way of kind of compensating for that was it gave us the opportunity to create these really cool cardboard masks of the characters for the kid to wear. But yeah, unfortunately, I mean, as you guys would know, the cardboard experience is not as cool as the Gear VR experience, so it meant that the kids' version of the story wasn't quite as great as the adults' version, which was sort of a shame.
Hi, Thomas from ExitSide. First of all, I love the idea, and I think it very much gets that VR is social and interactive. But I'm wondering, especially with that topic, there must be a lot of critical parents. We already see it with smartphones and other technology, but even more so with putting a headset. What was the feedback that you received on that? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, that was something that was definitely. I found it weird that it was so polarizing when we put the film out. Because a lot of people express that point of view. And I think it's perfectly fair. I think when any new technology comes along, obviously there's a certain amount of anxiety about it. And probably everyone in this room suffers from a smartphone addiction or an internet addiction of one sort or another. And that's something that we're passing on to our kids. And there's all this scaremongering that we're changing the neurological structure of our brains. And yeah, there's maybe a certain amount of truth in that. I think in this case, actually, what's maybe exciting about VR in general is that when you see your kids playing with an iPad or a phone or whatever, there's sort of this barrier between you and them. In virtual reality, at least I can kind of go into the world that they're in and I can meet them in that world. And this is just iteration number 1 on platform number 1 that we have. But imagine this when I'm taking my kids on explorative trips to Yosemite or up into space, but in a real kind of enriching, educational way. I think that there will be a chance, when all of our kids are sort of hooked on the internet and the internet is just this thing that's permanently strapped to our faces, it may actually be a better world than it is now. I mean, obviously I don't know, but at least we'll be able to kind of communicate with one another. Thank you very much. Cheers.